1 year after abandoning his dying wife, he came back for her inheritance. What he found changed everything. The decision that would define his fate. David had always been a man who thought with his head, not his heart. As a young man, he had built his life on ambition and the pursuit of success. His eyes had always been on the prize, wealth, power, and the kind of life that many could only dream of. But to David, the woman he married, Clara, was never more than a means to an end. She was kind, gentle, and everything he wasn't, but there was something else about her that David saw as valuable: her family's wealth. Clara had inherited a substantial fortune from her late father, a wealthy businessman, but little did she know her marriage to David would soon be overshadowed by betrayal. Clara, who had once been full of life, suddenly found herself fighting for survival. At the age of 29, a rare and unexpected illness struck her, and she was diagnosed with a terminal condition that would slowly rob her of her strength and her ability to live independently. It was a shock to everyone, but perhaps no one more than David. David's reaction to Clara's illness was not what you might expect from a loving husband. He had never been particularly empathetic, but the illness gave him the perfect opportunity to distance himself from the woman he had married. Clara's illness left her bedridden and unable to care for herself, and David found himself increasingly repulsed by the sight of her suffering. "I can't keep doing this," he muttered to himself one night after hearing Clara's faint cries for help. His patience had worn thin, and he had become indifferent to her needs. In his mind, there was only one solution: send her away. David turned to his mother, a woman with a heart as cold as her judgment, and proposed a plan. "Mom," David said, his voice dripping with the usual sense of entitlement, "I can't take care of her anymore. She's just a burden. I'll send her to her grandmother's village. It's quiet, isolated. No one will bother her, and no one will know what happens." Mrs. Bennet. David's mother had always seen Clara as an obstacle in the way of her son's ambition. The idea of Clara being out of sight and out of mind was appealing to her. "That's a good idea, David." Mrs. Bennet replied without hesitation. "She'll be out of the way, and once she's gone, well, you'll have the inheritance." David's eyes sparkled at the thought. It wasn't just about getting rid of Clara, it was about what would come afterward. He could already picture himself with full access to Clara's wealth. The business, the house, the family's assets, all of it would be his. And so without a second thought, he arranged for Clara to be taken to the remote village where her grandmother had lived. He told her that it was for her own good that she would have a peaceful place to recover away from the stress of the city. Clara, too weak to protest, allowed him to take her there. It was a cold and gray day when David drove her to the village. The roads were bumpy, the houses scattered and sparse. Clara, sitting silently in the back of the car, could barely keep her eyes open. David glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her fragile form barely noticeable against the dark seat. "Don't worry, Clara," he said, his tone cold and indifferent. "You'll be fine here. It's peaceful quiet. Just like you wanted. Right?" Clara couldn't respond, but her eyes, dull and tired, flickered in his direction. In that brief moment, David felt a pang of guilt, but it was fleeting. He quickly dismissed it. He had no intention of looking back. The house in the village was small, isolated. The air was thick with dust, the walls covered in ivy and vines. It was the perfect place for Clara to fade into obscurity. David unloaded her belongings and watched as the elderly woman who was supposed to care for her, her nurse as David put it, staggered out to greet him. "She's all yours now," David said curtly to the woman, barely waiting for a response before getting into his car and speeding away. A year passed. During that time, David rarely visited Clara. He had convinced himself that she was in good hands, that there was nothing more to be done. His focus was solely on his own life, his career, his plans for the future, and most importantly, the inheritance that was waiting for him once Clara was gone. But what David didn't know was that the quiet, secluded life he had arranged for Clara was not as it seemed. He had underestimated her strength, and more importantly, he had underestimated the people who cared about her. The unseen strength. A year had passed since David left Clara in the quiet village, and not a single day went by without him thinking about the fortune he was about to inherit. But with each passing month, something inside him began to stir. He had buried the idea of his wife's death under layers of distractions, work meetings, new opportunities, but deep down, he knew the moment was coming. The moment when Clara would be gone, and everything that had once belonged to her would be his. David had grown accustomed to the distance. He didn't visit her. He didn't call. All communication was left to the caretaker, an elderly woman named Margaret, who kept David's visits to a minimum. It suited him just fine. After all, Clara was no longer his concern. She was a sick woman waiting to die, and he had moved on. Or so he thought. One afternoon, as David was going through his usual routine papers to sign meetings, to attend investments, to finalize, he received a call that he wasn't expecting. It was from Margaret Clara's caretaker, Mr. Bennett. Margaret's voice was shaky. "I'm afraid, Clara, she's not doing well. I think you should come and see her." David felt a tightening in his chest, but he quickly pushed it aside. It wasn't grief he was feeling. It was more of an inconvenience. "How much longer does she have?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Margaret hesitated. "I'm not sure, Mr. Bennett, but I think it's time for you to prepare yourself." David exhaled sharply. "I'll be there tomorrow." He hung up the phone, feeling an unease that he couldn't shake. He hadn't been back to the village in months, and the idea of facing Clara again brought with it a strange sense of dread. But the inheritance was close now. He needed to ensure everything would go according to plan. The journey to the village was long, and the closer he got, the more David felt an overwhelming sense of anticipation. The road was narrow and winding, surrounded by thick trees that seemed to close in on him as he drove. By the time he reached the village, it was late afternoon, and a dark cloud loomed overhead as though the heavens themselves were judging him. David pulled up to the house where Clara had been left to live out her final days. The same overgrown garden greeted him, but something was different. The house looked cared for. The broken gate had been fixed, the grass trimmed. It wasn't just a lonely, abandoned property anymore, it had life. Something David didn't expect. He parked the car and stepped out, feeling the cool breeze against his face. "Clara," he muttered under his breath, almost as though the name itself had become foreign to him. As he approached the front door, the caretaker Margaret opened it with a forced smile. "Mr. Bennett, thank you for coming." David didn't return the smile. He was here for business, not pleasantries. "How is she?" Margaret sighed, leading him inside. The house was warm, unlike the cold, desolate place he had expected. The walls, once bare and peeling, were now adorned with paintings and photographs. Clara's presence was felt in every room. It unnerved him. "She's in the back room," Margaret said softly, her voice tinged with sorrow. David walked through the house, his footsteps echoing on the polished wooden floors. When he reached the back room, he paused for a moment, trying to prepare himself for what he would see. But nothing could have prepared him for the sight that awaited him. Clara was sitting in a chair, but she wasn't the frail, sick woman he remembered. She looked alive. She had color in her cheeks, and her eyes sparkled with a life he thought had long been gone. Clara, in the most unexpected way, had not only survived, she had thrived. Her once emaciated frame had filled out, and she no longer seemed the weak, helpless woman he had left behind. She was sitting upright, her back straight, and her hands were folded delicately in her lap. She wore a simple dress, but there was an undeniable elegance in her presence that left David momentarily speechless. "Well, well, look at you." David finally spoke, his voice low. "I didn't expect you to be, well, this." Clara didn't respond immediately. She simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. She looked more beautiful than he remembered, more confident, more at peace. It was as though the illness that had once claimed her body had also been a catalyst for something greater inside of her. "I'm surprised to see you," she finally said, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't think you'd come back." David swallowed hard, the uncomfortable silence between them stretching on for a few moments. He glanced away, unwilling to let her see the vulnerability creeping in. "I came for what's mine," he said flatly, his mind already on the inheritance. "You know the money, your family's estate." Clara's gaze didn't falter. "Is that why you came?" "David?" "For the money." David's eyes narrowed, but he couldn't help the edge of guilt creeping into his chest. He'd never intended to be this blunt, but the truth was the money was his reason for being there. He could feel his fingers itching, longing to grasp what was rightfully his. "You didn't think I came to see you, did you?" he said, his tone biting. "You're not exactly the woman I married anymore." Clara's eyes seemed to pierce through him. She didn't flinch or shrink away from his words. Instead, she sat calmly in her chair as if she were in complete control. "You're wrong, David," she replied softly. "I'm exactly the woman you married. But I've learned a few things in your absence. I've learned about strength, and about the power of self-worth." David frowned. "What are you talking about?" Clara smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You left me to die, David. But I didn't die. And now you've come back expecting to take everything from me. You're not going to get it that easily." David's heart raced. Something about Clara's words unsettled him, but he pushed it aside. "It's not about you, Clara. It never was." Clara's smile faded, and she reached for something hidden beneath the blanket in her lap. She pulled out a letter. "This," she said, her voice calm but firm, "is my inheritance, and it's not for you." David took a step forward, his eyes scanning the letter. His mind raced. What was this? What did it mean? Why had she waited until now to reveal it? The truth unveiled. David stood frozen, staring at the letter in Clara's hands. His pulse quickened as confusion and panic began to flood his thoughts. The woman who had been nothing more than a frail, mute figure in his mind had just delivered a bombshell. His eyes darted back and forth between her calm, unwavering face and the letter she clutched so tightly. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive. "You think you can just walk in here and claim everything? Don't you?" Clara said quietly, her voice still soft but with an edge of determination that David had never heard before. "That's not going to happen." David took a few steps forward, his feet dragging against the wooden floor, unwilling to show any weakness. "What do you mean you're still my wife? I've waited a year for this. I thought you were dead, Clara." "I have every right." "You have no rights," Clara interrupted, her eyes locking with his, sharp and clear. "I've had more than enough time to think about everything, David. And this letter, this inheritance, it's the final piece of my life. It's not for you. It was never for you." David took a step back. His confidence wobbled for the first time since his arrival. "I don't understand," he muttered, glancing down at the letter she held, then at the stillness of the room. "What are you talking about?" "You can't." Clara's smile grew slightly, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was a knowing, almost pitying smile, like she had anticipated this moment for a long time. "You've been so focused on the money, David, but you missed everything else. You missed me." She didn't give him a chance to respond. She stood up from her chair, her movements slow but deliberate. The years of illness had not taken away the grace that still lingered in her. She reached for a nearby table and handed him the letter, this time holding it out between them like a final piece of a puzzle he couldn't solve. "I'll tell you what's in the letter, David," she said, her voice firm. "It's a document that states I'm leaving everything I own to someone else, to someone who has supported me, who hasn't abandoned me. It's not going to you." David felt the cold chill of reality settle in his chest. He reached out, grabbing the letter, trying to open it with trembling hands, but Clara stopped him with a simple gesture. "Don't bother," she said calmly. "You'll find out everything soon enough." David's heart pounded in his chest. "Who?" he asked, his voice rising. "Who is it for?" Clara didn't answer immediately. She stood across from him, almost regal in her calmness. "It's for someone who saw me, who understood me when I had nothing left to give." David's eyes narrowed. A sense of dread of impending doom washed over him. He glanced around the room, his gaze landing on the photograph frames that adorned the walls. Family portraits, images of Clara in better days, before her stroke, before the illness that had left her trapped in a world of silence. Who? David's voice cracked this time, desperation creeping in. "Clara, tell me. Please." Clara took a deep breath, letting the silence hang in the air like a heavy weight. Then she spoke, her words coming as a slow, deliberate release. "It's for Elliot." David's world stopped. For a moment he couldn't breathe. He blinked, trying to process the words she'd just said, but they didn't make sense. "Elliot," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara nodded as if she had been waiting for him to understand. "Yes, Elliot. He's been the one who's been there for me. He's the one who helped me heal, who believed in me when everyone else abandoned me." David's mind raced, his thoughts colliding into one another. That man, the farmer." His voice grew louder, incredulous. "You're telling me you're giving everything to him? The guy who mows your lawn and fixes things around the house?" Clara's eyes narrowed as she stood tall, holding her ground. "Yes. He's the one I've built a life with, David. He's the one who didn't walk away when things got tough. He's the one who saw me for who I truly am." David's anger flared up like a firestorm. His fingers clenched into fists. "You think he deserves everything after everything I've done for you? You're my wife, Clara, not his. I'm the one who stuck around, not him." Clara stepped closer to him, her face unreadable. "You were never here, David. You were always too busy thinking about your own gains. You left me in a remote village, not even checking on me. You thought I would just die, that you could move on. But I didn't die. And I found something more valuable than money, someone who truly cares for me. And that's who I'm leaving everything to." David's chest heaved with frustration. "You can't do this," he shouted, but the words rang hollow. his voice trembling with an unfamiliar fear. Clara's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "I've already done it, David. And now it's over." The weight of her words crushed him. His mind went blank for a moment, the reality of what she was saying sinking in. He had walked into this house with plans of taking everything from her. But now the tables had turned. It wasn't just the inheritance that had slipped through his fingers. It was Clara's life, her love, her trust, all things he had never truly valued. For the first time in a long time, David felt the sting of regret. But it was too late for that. Clara had already made her choice, and nothing he said or did would change it. The reckoning. David stood motionless in Clara's living room, his thoughts spinning wildly, unable to grasp the weight of her words. The anger that had initially flared up now simmered into something colder, something more dangerous: fear. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. He had walked into this situation thinking he could easily manipulate Clara, but now the tables had turned, and the sharp reality of his mistakes crashed into him like a tidal wave. Clara's eyes met his with an unspoken challenge, as if she knew exactly what he was thinking. She had seen through him all along, and now the truth was out. He had underestimated her, but now it was too late. He had nothing left to fight with. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the weight of everything unsaid. Finally, David broke the quiet, his voice shaky but defiant. "You can't just give everything to him, Clara. It's mine, too. We were married. This is our money, our future. You don't just throw it away for someone like Elliot." Clara's expression hardened. "You don't get it, do you? It was never ours. It was never yours. You've been using me all along, David, and now you want to use Elliot too. I'm done being used." David stepped forward, trying to close the distance between them, his mind racing for a way to turn the situation in his favor. But Clara wasn't backing down. She stood her ground, unmoved. "You have no right to this," she continued, her voice steady. "I don't owe you anything. I've spent the past year slowly dying inside, and when I finally came to realize what truly matters in life, I found it wasn't the money or the property. It was the people who cared. People like Elliot." David's face twisted in disbelief. "You really expect me to believe this? That that man is the one who's been there for you? You left me for him?" Clara's lips curved into a bitter smile. "No, David. I didn't leave you for him. I left you when I realized you never truly cared. I stayed because I thought I had to. I thought I was supposed to. But I see now that I was just a tool for you to get what you wanted." David's hands clenched at his sides, the words hitting him harder than he expected. He had never been forced to face his own actions like this. "You're wrong, Clara. I didn't do anything wrong. I did everything for you, for us. I've always had your best interests at heart." Clara shook her head slowly, the disappointment in her eyes cutting deeper than any insult could. "If you had my best interests at heart, David, you would have stayed with me. You would have been there, but you weren't. And now you want everything that's mine. Everything I worked for, everything I've built you, think you can just take it because you think you're entitled to it." David took a step back, realizing for the first time how much he had lost. He had walked away from her. He had walked away from everything that truly mattered, all for the sake of a quick and easy gain. And now the consequences were catching up with him. "Where is it?" David Clara's voice broke through his thoughts. "Where's the compassion you promised me? Where's the love we were supposed to have? You never showed me that. You never wanted to." He was silent for a long time, struggling to find the words to defend himself. But the reality was there was nothing left to say. He had no justification. He had no defense. All he had left were the memories of a life he had never truly valued. "I thought I could change," David whispered, his voice cracking. "I thought if I just did what was expected of me, everything would be okay. But I was wrong. I was selfish. And now it's too late." Clara's eyes softened slightly, but there was no trace of forgiveness in them. "You should have realized that a long time ago," she said quietly. "You're too late for redemption now. I've already made my choice. Elliot is the one who has been there for me, and it's him who I'm building a future with." David's chest tightened at the thought of losing her forever. He had always taken Clara for granted, thinking that she would always be there waiting for him. But now that dream was slipping through his fingers. "Clara, please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Clara took a step back, her posture resolute. "There's nothing left for you here, David. I'm done. I don't owe you anything. You'll never understand, but maybe one day you'll realize what you lost." As she turned to walk away, David's heart broke. He reached out as if to stop her, but the words caught in his throat. The realization that he had lost her, the one person who had ever truly cared for him, was suffocating. He had always known she was strong, but he had never seen her like this. He had underestimated her resilience. "Goodbye, David," Clara said softly, her back to him now. "Don't come back." With that, Clara left the room, her footsteps echoing in David's mind as he stood frozen, the weight of his own failure crushing him. As Clara's footsteps faded, David stood there immobilized, a storm of emotions churning inside him. The last words she had spoken to him, "Don't come back," were like a slap that reverberated through his very soul. He wanted to call out to stop her, but something held him back. Was it pride? Or was it the crushing weight of guilt finally settling in, forcing him into a painful stillness? This moment, this painful realization that Clara had left him, not because she didn't love him, but because she finally understood who he really was the beginning of a personal reckoning for David. There in the empty room, his mind was flooded with questions, regrets, and fragments of memories that he had long pushed aside. Up until that moment, David had always believed Clara was just a naive woman, easily manipulated by his charm, his promises, and his manipulation. He thought she was weak, someone who would always bend to his will. He had never expected her to fight back, to stand her ground, to finally see through his act. But Clara's transformation in this moment was a stark revelation to David. He had never seen her so resolute, so determined. She wasn't the fragile, sickly wife he had abandoned in a remote village. She had blossomed into someone who understood her worth, someone who had no tolerance for the lies and betrayal that had once bound her to him. In that room, for the first time, David realized that his wife had been breaking silently all these years, and this was the culmination of her internal awakening. She had been living in the shadow of his deceit and selfishness, but she had finally come into her own power. The woman standing before him was not the same woman he had married. She had shed the role he had imposed on her. And what David hadn't anticipated was that Clara's strength would be her salvation. As Clara's words echoed in his mind, David's thoughts drifted back to their years together, their marriage, the promises he had made, and the life they had built. In hindsight, he realized just how little he had truly invested in their relationship. His decisions, actions, and constant betrayal had hollowed out any chance for real love between them. He had never been present in the ways that mattered. Clara had been a woman who dreamed of building something for herself, of taking control of her life beyond just being a supportive wife. But David, blinded by his selfish ambitions, had never truly seen her. He had married her for her wealth, for her potential. His desire to control her inheritance had pushed him to make choices that forever altered their relationship. When Clara had been ill, David had left her to die. His feelings for her had disappeared the moment she became a burden. He told himself he was doing it for the money, rationalized that he had to let her go in order to secure a future with her inheritance. But deep down he knew it was about more than that. He had always believed he was smarter, that he could manipulate the situation and win at all costs. But now, as the weight of his own cruelty fell on him, he couldn't deny the ugly truth: his selfishness had destroyed everything that mattered. David had never learned to love her for who she was. He had only loved the version of her that served his needs. And now, with Clara leaving him, he was confronted with a stark and brutal reality: he had sacrificed everything for nothing. Regret is a peculiar feeling. At times it feels like a suffocating fog, thickening the air around you until every breath is labored, every thought becomes a dark reflection of missed opportunities. That's what David felt now, a deep, gnawing regret that consumed him, leaving him with nothing but a hollow ache. As Clara walked out, David's mind replayed their final conversations, his cruel decisions, and the subtle signs he had missed, the moments when Clara tried to communicate her pain, her frustration, her silent pleas for him to notice her. But he hadn't cared. He hadn't even tried. And now the consequences were upon him. The images of their life together, once clouded by his selfishness, began to appear with terrifying clarity. He remembered how Clara had once been full of dreams he had dismissed as childish or impractical. She had wanted a career, wanted to succeed on her own terms. But David had belittled her aspirations, brushing them off as distractions. In his mind, her only role was to be his wife, to take care of his needs. He thought of the time when they first met, how she had looked at him with such admiration, such trust. At that time, David had felt powerful, adored. But now that power had vanished. He had squandered it all, and in its place was the devastating knowledge that he had lost her for good. David stood there alone in the room long after Clara had left. His hands were trembling. His heart, once a fortress of arrogance, was now an open wound. He realized there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. Clara had finally taken control of her life and in doing so had left him behind. He would never get the inheritance he had hoped for, and more importantly, he had lost the one person who could have ever truly loved him. For the first time, David saw himself clearly. He was not the smart, manipulative man he had always believed himself to be. He was a fool. And in his pursuit of money, he had lost everything that mattered: his wife, his integrity, and his chance at redemption. The silence in the room was deafening, but David could no longer ignore the truth. His life was in shambles, and he had no one to blame but himself. The anger he had once felt towards Clara was replaced with something more profound, deep, irreversible regret. He was alone now, and he had no one to turn to. And as the darkness of his own choices closed in on him, David understood one painful truth: some things once lost can never be regained. As David stood in the silent aftermath of his personal destruction, he couldn't help but wonder if there was a way to repair the irreparable. The idea of redemption, of somehow regaining Clara's trust, filled his mind in a way it never had before. The thought was terrifying, for it meant confronting his own failures head-on, acknowledging the depth of his cruelty, and perhaps most difficult of all, accepting that forgiveness was not something he could demand, but something that had to be earned. The road ahead was a dark one, and David felt as though he were walking blindfolded. He had spent so long constructing a life of manipulation, lies, and deceit that the very idea of changing felt like an impossible task. Could he truly be different? Could he undo the damage he had caused to the one person who had ever truly cared for him? The questions were endless, and every answer seemed to slip further from his grasp. It was in the quiet of that room, sitting alone with his thoughts, that David came face to face with his deepest fears. He replayed his interactions with Clara one by one, searching for moments of kindness, of warmth, of love. What had he really given her? What had he truly sacrificed for her? The answer was painfully clear: nothing. He had given her nothing but broken promises and cruel indifference. But the haunting thought that gnawed at him the most was that Clara had never truly seen him. She had never seen the man. He could have been the man he was capable of being. He had become a hollow version of himself, more focused on his desires than her needs. In his quest for wealth, he had forgotten that love was never about what you could take, it was about what you could give. David had always been proud of his ability to manipulate situations to control the narrative. But now, sitting in the aftermath of his choices, he realized how fragile his power had been. He had tried to control Clara, to bend her to his will, but in doing so he had lost the only person who had ever truly mattered. And now he was left with nothing but the wreckage of his own ego. But somewhere deep within the wreckage, David found the flicker of something that felt almost like hope. It wasn't the grand, sweeping redemption he had once envisioned. It wasn't some momentous event that would suddenly right all his wrongs. Instead, it was the quiet, steady realization that change could only begin with him. David had spent so much of his life blaming the world, blaming others for his unhappiness. He blamed his mother for being too controlling, his colleagues for their lack of respect, his wife for being too weak to see his brilliance. But now, in this moment of clarity, David understood that the problem had never been the world around him. The problem had always been him. In the weeks that followed Clara's departure, David spent his days in a fog of introspection. He tried to reach out to her, but every attempt was met with rejection, a silent reminder that his place in her life had been irrevocably erased. For a while, he was tempted to give up. After all, what hope did he have of winning her back after everything he had done? But then a turning point came when David received a letter from Clara. It was simple, direct, and cut through his despair with brutal honesty. She wrote that she had moved on, that she had found peace in her own way without him. The letter ended with a single line: "I have learned to love myself again, David. And in doing so, I no longer need you." Her words were like a dagger to his heart, but at the same time they were the wake-up call he so desperately needed. Clara had found strength, found peace, and found a way to move on from him. The woman he had once tried to control, the woman he had abandoned, had found a way to thrive without him. That was the ultimate betrayal, not just the loss of her, but the realization that she didn't need him at all. David's journey toward redemption, if it could even be called that, was a slow and painful one. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping apologies that could undo the damage he had caused. Instead, it was a quiet, solitary process, a reworking of his character from the ground up. He began by confronting the people he had hurt over the years, not expecting forgiveness, but seeking to understand their pain and offer them the same self-awareness that had begun to awaken within him. His relationship with his mother, Mrs. Pickles, was perhaps the hardest to mend. The woman who had enabled his selfishness, who had shaped so much of his misguided worldview, was now a mirror to his own flaws. He tried to talk to her, tried to explain that he was no longer the man she had raised, but the words were always met with dismissal, with scorn. She couldn't see the change in him, and perhaps David realized that was for the best. Not everyone would be able to forgive him, and that was something he had to come to terms with. But he had made the first step, a step that Clara had already taken long before he could bring himself to. He had learned that redemption wasn't about winning back what you had lost. It was about understanding the full weight of your actions and the irreversible damage they caused. It was about letting go of the need to control and instead learning to live with the consequences. David's final decision came quietly. He realized that despite his best efforts, he could never truly fix what had been broken. Clara's departure was not something that could be undone. He had lost her forever, not because of the inheritance, but because of the way he had treated her, the way he had treated himself. As he stood on the porch of his empty house, gazing out into the horizon, David felt the weight of his choices settle on him like a heavy blanket. The woman he had loved was gone, and the life he had wanted to build for himself was now a distant memory. But in that silence, in that painful moment of understanding, David felt a sense of peace. He would never get the inheritance, he would never get Clara back. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could still rebuild his life, starting with the one thing he had long ignored himself, the moment of truth. It had been 2 months since David had left his wife Clara in that small, forgotten village. He hadn't seen her since, and the guilt that once plagued him had started to fade, replaced by an unshakable feeling of entitlement. He had allowed himself to believe that his actions had been justified, that the money from Clara's inheritance would be the answer to all his problems. He had worked hard after all, and surely he deserved something in return for his patience and dedication. But the moment he stepped foot back into the village, that familiar sense of dread slowly crept up on him. David parked his car at the edge of the overgrown lane, staring at the house where Clara had once lived, the house that had been a symbol of his abandonment. The faded wooden fence, the garden tangled with weeds, the house itself, it all looked like a place forgotten by time. It was as though the house had not just been left behind by Clara, but by the world itself. He walked up to the front door, hesitated, and then knocked. It was almost like he didn't want to open it. But he had come for a reason. The inheritance. The money. The life that awaited him on the other side of this door. A long silence passed before the door creaked open. He half expected Clara to be standing there, her frail body in a wheelchair as he had last seen her. Instead, he was greeted by a middle-aged man wearing worn-out clothes, his face covered in dirt. David frowned, irritation bubbling up within him. "Who are you?" he asked coldly, eyeing the stranger up and down. The man straightened up and met his gaze. "Elliot," he replied, his voice calm but carrying an edge. "Clara's partner." David's mind briefly went blank. Partner. What was he talking about? Clara had been abandoned here, left alone to die. How could she possibly have a partner? His grip tightened on the doorframe. "What do you mean, partner?" he demanded. "She's my wife." Elliot's gaze remained steady, unshaken by David's outburst. "Clara's been taken care of here," he said slowly, his tone calm but firm. "She's not the same woman you left behind." David's stomach churned as the weight of those words sank in. Clara had been alone for so long, suffering, and now this man was telling him she had found someone to care for her. The thought should have made him feel relieved, but it didn't. All it did was anger him. "Where is she?" David asked, his voice tight with frustration. "I want to see her, now." Elliot stepped aside, motioning for David to enter the house. "Follow me," he said quietly. The house smelled faintly of herbs and fresh flowers, an oddly calming scent that seemed to cling to every corner. The walls, once cracked and peeling, had been painted, the floors polished, and the place had a warmth to it that David didn't recognize. This was not the cold, empty house he had abandoned his wife in. They passed through the narrow hallway and into a cozy living room. The room was filled with soft light, the curtains gently swaying with the breeze from the open windows. In the corner, Clara sat in a comfortable armchair, a soft smile on her face as she looked up at David. For a moment, he didn't recognize her. She was still pale, yes, but there was a lightness about her now, a peacefulness that he had never seen before. She was not the woman he had left behind. David's heart pounded in his chest as he took a hesitant step forward, unsure of what to say. Clara's eyes met his, and for the first time in over a year, he felt the weight of their connection. But it wasn't the connection of a husband and wife. It was the gaze of a stranger, someone he no longer knew. "Clara," His voice cracked as he spoke her name, the guilt suddenly crashing over him like a tidal wave. She smiled softly, but there was something in her eyes, a sadness, perhaps even forgiveness, but also a quiet strength that David had never seen before. "You came," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the years of silence between them. "I wasn't sure you would." David couldn't find the words. He had come for the inheritance, for the money. But in that moment, looking at Clara, he realized he had come for something else, something far more valuable than any amount of money. I thought you wouldn't make it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Clara nodded. "I didn't think I would either." Her voice faltered, but she continued, "But I did, and I've learned to live with the choices I made." David looked at her, the woman who had once been his everything. She wasn't the fragile, helpless wife he had left behind. She was someone else now, someone stronger, someone who had learned to survive without him. Elliot stepped forward, then his presence a quiet reminder that Clara had not been alone during her recovery. "She's doing much better now," Elliot said, his voice calm but carrying a sense of pride in his words. "She's been working on the farm with me, helping with the animals. She's strong." David swallowed hard, his throat tight. "The farm," he repeated, his mind racing. "What do you mean? This house? Is this your doing?" Elliot nodded. "It is. Clara's been part of it all. She's been helping me manage everything. She's more capable than you realize." The words hit David like a slap in the face. The woman he had left behind, the woman he had abandoned, had managed to rebuild her life. And not just that she had done it without him, without any of his support. He felt small, insignificant. The money he had been counting on suddenly seemed meaningless. Clara's eyes softened as she looked at him, almost as if she could read his mind. "David, I'm not angry with you," she said quietly, her voice filled with an unexpected calmness. "I had to let go of that anger a long time ago. You can't carry that burden forever." David didn't know what to say. He stood there feeling the weight of his actions press down on him. He had come for the inheritance, but now he saw that he had lost something far more valuable, his connection to the woman who had once been his world. "I didn't know how to love you." David whispered the words, slipping out before he could stop them. "I thought I did, but I didn't. I was selfish." Clara didn't respond immediately. She just looked at him, her gaze steady and unflinching. "You don't have to apologize," she said softly. "You've already shown me who you are." David stood there in silence, the weight of her words settling on him. He had thought that money, that inheritance, would fix everything. But now, as he stood before Clara, he realized that no amount of money could ever buy back what he had lost. Clara had moved on. She had found peace, found strength, and now David had to face the reality of what he had done. The inheritance would come, but it wouldn't bring him the peace he had hoped for. David's journey had only just begun. The price of betrayal. David sat silently in the living room, the weight of his own thoughts pressing heavily on him. Clara's peaceful composure was a stark contrast to the storm of emotions brewing inside him. He had come here expecting to claim an inheritance, to find a simple resolution to all his financial problems. But instead, he had walked into a reality that was completely different from the one he had imagined. The woman he had abandoned had survived, thrived even without him. She had found a purpose, built a life, and found people who truly cared for her. And David was left standing on the sidelines, grappling with his own guilt and shame. Clara, noticing his silence, spoke gently. "David, you're not here just for the money. I can tell. If you were, you would have taken it and left. But you're still here. What is it that you want from me?" Her words hit him hard. He had no real answer. The truth was, he didn't know what he wanted anymore. The inheritance. Yes, but that was a means to an end. The real reason he had returned was something much deeper, something he hadn't even acknowledged until now, a longing to reclaim something he had lost, his sense of worth, his sense of purpose, and maybe, just maybe, to find forgiveness for the life he had destroyed. "I don't know what I want," David admitted quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought I wanted the money. I thought it was all I needed, but now I'm not so sure." Clara didn't respond immediately. She simply sat there looking at him with a mixture of compassion and detachment. She had moved on from him, from their past. She had her life now, one that didn't include him. And David realized that he wasn't sure where he fit in it anymore. He had expected that coming back would give him some kind of closure, but instead it left him feeling more empty than ever. Elliot, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, stepped forward and placed a hand on David's shoulder. "You can't undo the past, David," he said, his voice firm yet kind. "But you still have the opportunity to make better choices. It's not too late to change." David looked up at him, surprised by his words. "What do you mean?" Elliot looked between Clara and David, his expression serious. "What I mean is this: you can't change what happened between you and Clara, but you can change how you move forward. If you truly want to make things right, you need to stop looking for excuses and start taking responsibility for everything. Your past, your mistakes, and the way you treated her." David flinched at the bluntness of Elliot's words, but he couldn't deny their truth. He had been running from his own mistakes, from the reality of his actions for so long, but now faced with the consequences of his choices, he had nowhere to hide. "I don't deserve her forgiveness," David murmured almost to himself. Clara finally spoke up, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable strength. "I never expected your forgiveness, David. I just wanted you to care, to be there when it mattered, but you weren't, and now I'm at peace with that. You have to find peace with your own actions." David sat there, overwhelmed by the weight of her words. For so long he had convinced himself that he was justified in his actions, that he was entitled to something more. But now the truth was undeniable. He had abandoned Clara, left her to suffer alone, and now she had moved on without him. "Clara, I'm sorry," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "I should have been there. I should have cared." Clara's gaze softened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she simply nodded, as though she had long ago accepted that apology in her heart. And in that moment, David realized something profound. It wasn't about the inheritance, it wasn't about the money or the business or the life he had dreamed of. It was about redemption. It was about the chance to prove that he could change, to show Clara and himself that he was capable of doing better. But that wasn't something he could do overnight. It was a journey that would take time he wasn't sure he had. Elliot, sensing the shift in the air, spoke again. "You can't just show up and expect everything to be fixed. That's not how this works. You want to make amends. Then start by accepting that you can't undo what's been done. But you can be a better man moving forward." David nodded slowly, processing his words. He knew Elliot was right. There was no quick fix to the damage he had caused. No amount of money or material possessions would erase the years of hurt he had inflicted on Clara. But maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for him to do better. To be better. "I don't know where to start," David confessed, his voice shaky. "But I want to try. I want to make it right." Clara met his gaze once more, her eyes full of wisdom and understanding. "The first step is admitting your mistakes, David. The next step is making the decision to change. And that change has to come from within you, not from anyone else." David looked at her, the woman he had wronged, and felt an overwhelming sense of guilt and shame. But along with that guilt came something else, something that had been missing from his life for far too long: hope. Hope that maybe he could change that, maybe he could make things right. Not just for Clara, but for himself. As he stood up ready to leave the house, Clara spoke again, her voice soft but firm. "David, the inheritance isn't yours to claim anymore. It's mine. I earned it. But what you do with your life now, that's up to you." With those final words, David left the house, not with the money he had once thought would fix everything, but with something far more valuable: the knowledge that redemption was possible if only he was willing to work for it. As he drove away, David couldn't help but feel the weight of Clara's words still echoing in his mind. It was no longer about what he had lost, it was about what he could still gain. Peace, forgiveness, a second chance, the path to redemption. As David drove away from the small house nestled in the quiet countryside, the weight of the moment pressed down on him. His thoughts were heavy, each one pulling him in a different direction. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what he could take or what he was entitled to. He wasn't thinking about the money, the inheritance, or the material things that had driven him for so long. No, now he was thinking about something far more profound: himself, his mistakes, the person he had become, and the person he wanted to be. The drive back to the city felt longer than usual, the road stretching endlessly before him. David's hands gripped the steering wheel as he replayed the conversation he had with Clara in his mind. He could still hear her voice, calm yet firm, when she had told him that the inheritance was no longer his to claim. That was a truth he had to face, a consequence of his own actions. But it wasn't just about money. It was about his choices, his lack of accountability, and the fact that Clara had found peace without him. He thought about how she had looked when he walked into the house, how she had transformed, not just physically, but emotionally. Clara had become stronger, more independent. She had faced life's challenges without him, and somehow she had emerged victorious. He couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. But alongside that regret, there was a realization she didn't need him. She had built a life for herself, one that didn't include the selfish, distant man he had been. As the city skyline loomed ahead, David couldn't help but wonder where his own journey would take him. He had spent so long chasing after fleeting desires focused on himself and his own ambitions. But now it was different. He wasn't sure how or when, but something inside him had shifted. He had to change, not for anyone else but for himself. When David arrived at his apartment, he didn't immediately head inside. Instead, he stood outside, staring at the building that had once felt like his sanctuary, the place where he could escape from everything. But now it felt empty, hollow. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his reverie. It was a message from Clara. "David, you may never fully understand the damage you caused, but I believe you can change. That's the only thing you can do now." He stared at the message for a moment before replying, "Thank you, Clara, for everything." As he read the message, David felt a sense of release. It wasn't the closure he had expected, nor the grand reconciliation he had once imagined, but it was something far more important: acceptance. Clara had forgiven him, not because he deserved it, but because she understood that forgiveness wasn't for him, it was for her. And now it was his turn to forgive himself. The next few days were a whirlwind of reflection and difficult decisions. David knew that he couldn't continue living the way he had been. He couldn't keep running away from his problems or avoiding responsibility. It was time to make amends, not just with Clara, but with himself. He began by reaching out to his colleagues, apologizing for his neglectful behavior at work and offering to take on more responsibility. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He knew that rebuilding his career would take time, but he was willing to put in the effort. He also reached out to some old friends, trying to reconnect with the people he had distanced himself from over the years. It was a humbling process, but one that he knew was necessary. David also began volunteering at a local charity, something that felt completely foreign to him but also deeply fulfilling. For the first time in years, he was helping others without expecting anything in return. It was a small step, but it was a step toward becoming the kind of person he had always wanted to be, a person who made a positive impact not just on his own life but on the lives of others. The following month, David returned to the village. He didn't expect Clara to welcome him with open arms, but he wanted to see her one last time. He wanted to show her that he had changed, even if it was just a little. When he arrived at the house, Clara was sitting on the porch watching the sunset. She looked up as he approached, and for a moment neither of them said anything. There was a long silence filled only with the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Finally, Clara spoke. "I didn't expect you to come back." David sat down beside her, the air between them thick with unspoken words. "I had to," he said quietly. "I wanted to show you that I'm trying to do better. I know it's too late to fix everything, but I want to make things right." Clara didn't reply right away. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then after a long pause, she nodded. "I don't know if I can forgive you, David," she said softly. "But I don't hate you anymore. I'm not angry. I've let go of that." David felt a weight lift from his chest. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. And that was all he could ask for. They sat in silence for a while longer, watching the sky change colors as the sun dipped below the horizon. In that moment, David felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he was ready to face it. He was ready to make amends, to change, to rebuild the life he had once taken for granted. And maybe, just maybe, he would find a way to earn back the trust he had lost. For the first time in a long time, David believed that redemption was possible. Not through wealth or material gain, but through the small, everyday choices that shaped who he was becoming. And that was enough. Redemption in the quiet moments. The days that followed David's quiet conversation with Clara felt like a turning point, a delicate shift in his life that had begun to reshape the future he had once thought was set in stone. He had expected rejection, anger, maybe even indifference, but what he received was something entirely different: understanding, even compassion. Clara's forgiveness was something David had never expected, and yet it became the foundation upon which he began rebuilding his life. Though the road ahead was uncertain, David knew one thing for sure: he would not return to the man he had been. He could never undo the damage, but he could choose to move forward with integrity and purpose. For the first time, he was living for something other than money, for something beyond his selfish desires. He was living for the possibility of becoming a better person, someone worthy of the second chance he had been given. David took some time to reflect on his past decisions, the ones that had led him to this point. The decisions that had left Clara in that small village abandoned alone while he chased after an inheritance that had no meaning. The money he had once thought was his key to happiness now seemed like nothing more than a hollow prize. It wasn't the wealth that he needed, but the ability to see beyond his own needs, to understand the worth of relationships and the importance of being present for others. As winter approached, David started taking small steps to integrate into the community again. He visited the local charity where he had volunteered, spending more time there, helping where he could. It wasn't easy at first. The city, with its fast pace and cutthroat atmosphere, had left him feeling isolated in many ways. But the simple acts of kindness he performed made him feel connected to something larger than himself. They gave him a sense of fulfillment that he had never experienced before. During one of his visits to the charity, David was introduced to a group of people who had faced immense challenges in their lives, some battling addiction, others struggling with financial instability. Yet despite the hardships they had endured, there was a sense of hope and resilience that inspired David. It was in those moments, surrounded by people who were actively working to rebuild their lives, that he realized the power of vulnerability, of owning up to mistakes, and of supporting others who were also trying to find their way. David spent time with people like Joe, a former businessman whose company had collapsed due to bad decisions, and Anna, a mother who had lost her child but had learned to navigate grief by helping others through their pain. Their stories weren't about success or wealth. They were about survival, about the human spirit's ability to endure and adapt. They were about the strength it took to get back up after life knocked you down, and how you could find redemption not in wealth, but in the way you lived your life moving forward. As for Clara, she continued to live in the village, quietly rebuilding her own life. She had opened a small shop selling handcrafted goods, a hobby she had once abandoned in favor of corporate success. It wasn't the business she had once dreamed of, but it was hers. She had finally found peace, not in her inheritance, but in the quiet, simple life she had always craved. She didn't need anything from David, not his money, not his approval. She had found her independence, her strength. One afternoon, months after David had left the village, he decided to visit Clara again. He didn't know what he hoped for. Maybe a friendship, maybe just a chance to show her how much he had changed, how much he had grown. He drove to the village this time without the heavy burden of expectations. When he arrived at her shop, he found Clara sitting behind the counter, her face lighting up when she saw him. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had passed between them. "I never thought I'd see you again," Clara said, her voice soft but steady. "How have you been?" David hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say, but then he simply spoke from his heart. "I've been learning," he said, "learning to live differently, to not be consumed by what I want, but to focus on what really matters." Clara looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I'm glad to hear that. It's not easy, but it's the only way." They spent the afternoon talking not about the past, but about the future, about the ways they had each found healing, the ways they had each chosen to grow. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, but it was enough. It was the first step toward understanding that sometimes redemption doesn't come in grand gestures or sweeping declarations. It comes in small, quiet moments of mutual respect and acceptance. As David left the village that day, he felt something shift in him once more. Not everything had been repaired, not everything had been fixed, but it didn't need to be. He wasn't looking for perfection anymore, he was looking for peace. And in the quiet moments of reflection as he drove away, he realized that peace wasn't something you find by running towards something, but by accepting the lessons life gives you and using them to become a better person. David wasn't a perfect man. He had made mistakes, but he was no longer defined by them. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer had control over him. The future was his to shape, and for the first time he felt ready to embrace it.